After erasing Nov, the channel's members have voted for deleting 4th Prince Terror-Sandwich from the timeline next. From a space-based to a time-based Hatsu. Makes sense. I like it. A quick reminder of the rules before we start. 1. I am not using a specific character but an imagined challenger who primarily scales with the Nen proficiency level of the specific character he is going up against. 2. No assassinations. 3. Neither character has the initiative advantage and both combatants can start with their Hatsu either prepped or initiated. 4. The imagined challenger has perfect info on the character he is going up against, while vice versa is not the case. 5. Winning entails killing or permanently incapacitating the opponent. 6. Escape is not an option for either character. 7. I may resort to imagined but very much possible Hatsu concepts if I really have to in order to properly counter a character. 8. I can only use specialization-based Hatsu against specialists. And 9. No outside interference. I don't usually even bother with mentioning this, but for Terror it's warranted. Them's the rules, and while I'd like us to go over Terror's combat skill set and physical stats before moving on to his ability proper, befitting his lofty status as a Prince of Kakin currently participating in the War of Succession, Terror-Sandwich will demand special amendments to both the regular flow of these videos and the rules that underpin them in order for this to be an actual fun hypothetical. Otherwise, either he's essentially invincible or he gets slaughtered so hard that it'd be hilarious. I'll explain what exactly I mean by that when I talk about his counters proper. For now, let me quickly explain why he requires special treatment in the first place. Rule 1 states that the imagined challenger primarily scales with an Nen proficiency level of the specific character he is going up against. But what does that mean in Terror's case? At what level is he? Yes, he is at a minimum a 1 in 10 million prodigy akin to Gon and Killua, but he's just begun to tap into his immense potential, and we don't actually know his current level of combat readiness as we've yet to see him go head-to-head against someone even in sparring. And even if he had sparred, we've had it said a few times that sparring can only go so far in simulating actual combat experience, which is irreplaceable. Despite still being a relative Nen scrub as of chapter 410, Terror came pre-wired with an amazingly complex and potent specialization-based Hatsu. The kind of Hatsu that would have required even a genius of his level years to properly develop under regular circumstances. I talk about this in my Hatsu level specialization video, but I consider this ability even more complex than Chrollo's current bandit secret, which is saying a lot. This discrepancy between his current level of Nen proficiency and the very high proficiency in Nen an ability like this warrants makes Terror, and consequently our imagined challenger, a pain in the butt to properly scale. So, here's what we're going to do. In order to make things as fair and fun as possible, I will A. say that Terror has mostly completed his combat training and has a decent mastery of Gyo, Shu, Ko, Ryu, etc. i.e. that he is Nen combat capable. This is important since we need Terror to actually be capable of damaging our challenger, and a Shu-empowered knife to the gut or a Ko-empowered punch to the face could do a lot more than simply deal damage. B. I'll give him the benefit of the doubt with regards to his ability. As in, since we don't know all the details about it, I'll interpret it as the most reasonably powerful version of itself. C. I will not be taking his guardian spirit beast into account, since I see it as a form of outside influence and we really don't know how combat capable it is. And D. Even though I can, as per the rules, I won't be using specialists or specialization-based Hatsu. Why? Well, since I am taking away his GSB, I felt like this should hopefully equalize the playing field. All in all, you can consider our imagined challenger as being just slightly above Knuckles and Shoot's level of Nen proficiency and mastery, i.e. no more than a step below someone of Morals or Nov's level. I think that's more than fair. Alright, with all that established, let's get into it. Let's now, very quickly since there's almost nothing to talk about, discuss Terror's combat skill set and physical stats before moving on to his ability proper. As established, we'll assume that this fight is occurring at the end of Terror's advanced combat training, wherein he would have already increased his physical stats and have gained an overall reasonable, decent mastery of the fundamental and advanced Nen techniques, such that he is capable of actually mortally wounding a Nen combatant. We can also assume that he does have something approximating actual combat experience, since he graduated from Kakin's military academy and had undoubtedly undergone basic field combat exercises at the bare minimum. Nonetheless, he will be reasonably below in terms of sheer speed, strength, durability, dexterity, reflexes, and so on, when compared to our challenger, who will be an experienced Nen combatant. This makes sense, since, as a high-ranking Kakin royal, he would have certainly spent most of his adult life attending various political or social gatherings, making public appearances, studying, enjoying his darker extracurricular activities, and so on. While obviously in excellent shape, and martially capable enough to easily overpower 2 drunk party girls before learning Nen. I doubt he's kept up his martial training anywhere close to the level of someone like First Prince Benjamin. In other words, Terror has to avoid a head-to-head brawl with our challenger at all costs, which in theory shouldn't be a problem considering his ability. Speaking of, let's get into his thus far unnamed ability, but one I'm choosing to call Beelzebub Ephemeral 10 Seconds. It allows Terror to glimpse 10 seconds into the future upon fulfilling the 2 conditions of 1. Entering Zetsu, and 2. Closing his eyes. This glimpse is instantaneous, meaning that as long as Terror keeps his Zetsu active and eyes closed, he'll always be 10 seconds ahead of everyone else. Then, when he does eventually decide to open his eyes and or resend his Zetsu, everyone else will, from his perspective, be reliving the 10 seconds Terror already experienced. While he can move freely about, everyone else perceives things and acts exactly like in the vision, meaning that if Terror moved, those around him would still see him as standing in the same spot and acting in the same way as he did in the vision. An important aspect of this ability is that it is facilitated by the Nen beast I'm calling Beelzebub. Since the condition for it to send Terror a vision of the future is for him to first enter Zetsu, the Nen beast is actually capable of storing a reserve of Terror's aura so as to keep itself manifested even after his aura nodes close. While we don't know how long that is, it's clear that this means Terror cannot keep the future sight always active, nor that he can spam it dozens of times throughout a day, or else risk exhausting his reserves. While his aura reserves have been established as incredibly impressive, they are not infinite, and manifesting, maintaining, and fueling the Nen beast with enough aura to activate and maintain as powerful an effect as its would, I have to imagine, take its toll. Now, there are more than a few things that are thus far unclear with regards to this ability, but 2 are of importance for us. First, while he can choose to open his eyes and then move freely about, it's thus far unknown whether or not he can actually physically interact with the people stuck living out the vision. For example, could he have just taken Theta's gun and shot her? Would she have regained her senses the moment Terror made physical contact? Would everyone affected regain their senses? If he had his own gun, could he have just shot Theta without first touching her, and in that way avoid dispelling the ability prior to landing a potentially lethal hit? We don't know. The second ambiguity is whether Terror has to maintain Zetsu while moving freely about during the ephemeral 10 seconds, or whether he can use his Nen normally in this period. The reason I say it's ambiguous is because neither Terror himself nor the diagram we were given mention this explicitly. The sole requirement needed for the vision to stop streaming into his consciousness is for Terror to open his eyes. Entering Zetsu is only mentioned as the initial requirement for initiating the vision. We do at least know that Zetsu must be maintained in order for Terror to be able to restart the vision without there being a gap in between uses. In other words, Terror can open his eyes, thereby releasing himself from the vision, move from the path of a gunshot for example, and then close his eyes again to restart his future sight and reintegrate himself in the vision without those around him ever having left it. Supposing he does so within 10 seconds of having initially opened them and maintains Zetsu the whole time, as mentioned. However, what happens happens if he decides he doesn't want to restart it and releases Zetsu during the 10 seconds his eyes are open and everyone around him is stuck reliving his vision of the future? Will he simply not be able to? I.e., would he be in a forced state of Zetsu for the duration? Would his ability immediately stop and the people released from Beelzebub's clutches? Or can he actually freely use his Nen even during the 10 seconds the people around him are stuck viewing the vision? As far as I'm concerned, it's essentially impossible that he can freely use Nen while still remaining in the vision, since that would simply be way too overpowered and far beyond an individual's capacity. Even if there was a restriction against him fueling Beelzebub during that time, he'd still have free reign to charge up a co-empowered punch for 10 whole seconds to absolutely decimate an opponent while they'd be entirely unable to react since they wouldn't be perceiving it. That's simply a no-go. Him being in a forced state of Zetsu, while very possible, makes it so that his ability isn't ideal for fighting, since he essentially wouldn't be able to harm a Nen-protected opponent. As such, we'll go with the middle ground of him being able to release Zetsu and, for example, go for a very quick co-empowered punch, while opening his aura nodes would immediately release his opponent from the vision. Through strategic positioning aided by his foresight, Terror could maneuver himself in the opponent's blind spot and quickly charge up his attack, meaning that he'd still very much have the element of surprise on his side. So as to not bloat the video even more and give reason to even more of you to click off if somehow you already haven't, thank you, I'll simply say that making physical contact meaningful enough to alter a person's predetermined course, e.g. moving or punching them, would, at least for them, end the vision. So, what would, under normal circumstances, be Terror's tactic in a fight given the parameters we've established? Well, the fourth prince would, of course, start any fight by immediately initiating his ephemeral 10 seconds. Then he'd see what his opponent's next action was. After his opponent made his move and revealed his plan of attack, the prince would wait as long as he could before opening his eyes, avoiding the attack in question, and repositioning himself in such a way so as to avoid taking any other potential hits. This would allow him to get the idea of his opponent's timing, style, ability, and so on. Then, after having assessed his opponent, he'd start to retaliate. While his opponent was hitting air, believing it to be Terror, the fourth prince would very quickly charge up a co-empowered attack to land a hit on the opponent. As per the established rules of his ability in this scenario, releasing Zetsu and channeling his aura would immediately dispel the illusion and reveal the real Terror. However, positioning himself in his opponent's blind spot should give the prince the precious second to charge up a quick co-empowered attack. He'd then, of course, immediately close his eyes and enter Zetsu, using that moment of disorientation and confusion to successfully retreat. Even if the opponent was durable enough to keep on fighting after taking a dozen of Terror's hits and even realized what was happening, they'd be unable to do anything about it, since they would already be stuck in his loop. The fourth prince would, of course, be able to see ahead of time if the opponent decided to ignore his illusory self and chose to attack randomly around themselves in the hopes of scoring a blind hit on him, or if they decided to wait for the real Terror to appear and strike then, meaning that the prince would be able to avoid any and all counter strategies the opponent may muster through appropriate positioning and counterattacks of his own. Depending on their physical capabilities and category, a dozen or so of quick co-empowered hits from the relatively physically unremarkable prince may be all that's necessary to end the fight. So, with that established, how do we go about countering fourth Prince Terror-Sandwich? Believe it or not, we've got options. Let's start from the most straightforward and arguably boring ones to the more fun, out-of-the-box ones. As we've established, the characters can start with their Hatsu either prepped or initiated, meaning that Terror can close his eyes and enter Zetsu to begin receiving his vision right as that non-existent bell rang, signaling the beginning of the fight. However, our challenger could also prep his ability as well, and one way to end Terror's reign of terror is through a sheer volume of firepower, i.e. by blasting his royal butt apart. Our challenger, equipped with Franklin's double machine gun, could just start blasting as soon as the bout began. Terror would enter Zetsu and see a wall of emitted nen streaking towards him at incredible speeds, and would see his body absolutely decimated by the onslaught of high-powered bullets. While true that our imagined challenger's ability wouldn't be on the same level as Franklin's, who I view as being reasonably above Knuckle or Shoot in terms of nen mastery and aura output, we could just sacrifice destructive power of each individual bullet in order to maintain the same volume. As has been plainly shown, while in Zetsu, the prince can be ended by a single shot from a regular handgun. Terror would, of course, attempt to stay calm and try to analyze the spray pattern and wait for it to pass, but it never would. The wall of bullets would be all-pervasive and wouldn't let up within those initial instantaneous 10 seconds. The fourth prince couldn't risk getting grazed by even a single projectile while in Zetsu, and would need to immediately rescind it in order to enhance his body so as to be able to move fast enough to potentially avoid some of them, and become durable enough so as to not get annihilated in a single hit. The problem then would be that he'd be stuck between a rock and a hard place, being unable to enter Zetsu to activate his ability, or else risk getting decimated, but also unable to retaliate and avoid or take the onslaught head on. His aforementioned lower physical stats and focus on quickly entering and maintaining Zetsu, as opposed to pure enhancement training, simply wouldn't allow him to tank or avoid too many of the dozens upon dozens high-speed projectiles heading his general direction. It's boring, but it gets the job done. The other standard way to go about it would be via one of my personal favorites, a simple blitz-type enhancer. As in, just imagine, seeing our challenger entering a stance and preparing to strike, Terror hurries to immediately enter Zetsu and activate his foresight. He is then almost instantaneously greeted with a rather unsavory sight of his own princely head flying across the room, only to plop down a few meters away. As he met the lifeless eyes of his own decapitated head, Terror would grow pale as the realization set in. He is not fast enough to dodge or durable enough to tank this attack. As soon as the ephemeral 10 seconds passed, his head would fly off his shoulders, and all he would have accomplished was getting an extra 10 seconds to truly wallow in self-pity. Another way to go about it may sound a bit strange at first, but bear in mind that our challenger has perfect info on his query's abilities. He could simply block Beelzebub's, i.e. the Nen Beast's, vision. As we've established, Terror sees the future from his Nen Beast perspective, and as far as we know, it cannot move freely about while channeling its vision into Terror's mind. If its vision is occluded, such as for example if the area was covered in a thick layer of smoke, there'd be no future for the fourth prince to see. If he couldn't see either himself or his opponent, he wouldn't know how his future self was reacting to our challenger's movements, which means that he'd be risking overlap between his future and actual selves. An overlap happening would mean that our challenger was actually engaging the real Terror and could deal damage to or capture him. So as to not risk that, Terror may decide to retreat and exit the smoke screen, only to realize that the smoke around him had become as hard as rock. A smoky jail equivalent would be in place, and our challenger could simply start gradually shrinking it, all the while attacking at random spots inside the mostly smoke-filled jail's area, until such a time as the jail has grown as small as a few meters, and Terror's pummeled body had stayed put for more than 10 seconds. The fourth way is both the weirdest and coolest, since I'm not sure whether or not it would work. What if Terror activated Beelzebub, smugly preparing himself to see what our challenger would do, only for our challenger to suddenly multiply a seemingly infinite number of times, with thousands upon thousands of afterimages of the challenger, each just slightly different from the rest, absolutely flooding Terror's field of view? Is the ability somehow misfiring? Why is it failing to predict our challenger's movements, but is instead showing an infinite myriad of potential actions he might take? The reason is cool in how mundane it is. What if our challenger was equipped with a Hatsu like Palm's Wink Blue? Wink Blue allows Palm to register someone by looking at them with just her right eye, and then see them wherever they are by looking through her left one. Now, we know that she was able to follow Poof's main body, despite the fact that he had created hundreds of clones of himself, which is a good precedent for us. Is it possible that by using Wink Blue, or a Wink Blue-like ability, our challenger would be able to keep tabs on and actually see the real Terror as he was moving about after opening his eyes? I think this is indeed quite likely. This especially if the Terror our challenger initially saw was the real one, but the ability may record Terror's original body even if what our challenger saw was the illusory Terror, since I'm 99% sure Palm recorded a clone of Poof, but was nonetheless able to keep tabs on the original. This would make Beelzebub, ephemeral 10 seconds, entirely unusable on our challenger. Why? Well, in being able to actually respond to Terror's movements, the Nen Beast's prediction would change thousands upon thousands of times in a single second, as the future challenger responded to the future Terror, who would then change his actions, prompting another change and then another, and so on ad infinitum. With his Hatsu neutralized, Terror would be forced to face our challenger, who, since he's borrowing Palm's category, would of course be an enhancer, and a much more physically capable and experienced Nen combatant on top of that. Fourth Prince Terror-Sandwich would be royally screwed. The final and potentially most surefire way to counter Terror is by employing a general mechanic of Nen, namely In. In is the borderline perfect counter to someone whose ability relies on Zetsu. Our challenger, using the abilities of those like Hisoka, Machi, and even Kurapika, could create a defensive trap around himself using invisible gum, threads, or chains, which would catch Terror the first time he tried to land a hit and feel out his opponent. We know from Uvogin and Castro that In doesn't simply visually conceal aura, but makes it effectively imperceptible. Our challenger would then simply wait for at least 10 seconds to pass following Terror being caught, so he isn't able to avoid the springing of the trap in the first place, after which our challenger could spring his trap at his leisure. Because even if the fourth prince saw what was about to happen, he wouldn't be able to stop it, as by being unable to use Gyo to properly see his restraints, he wouldn't be able to untangle himself. This of course isn't really a factor with Hisoka's gum due to its stickiness, so in that case it would really be game over. Now, this method isn't literally uncounterable, since Terror could always stand back, release Zetsu, and then use Gyo on his eyes to check for any end traps. Even if he did have the forethought to do that and was lucky enough to do it at just the right time, it wouldn't help him that much, since our challenger would plainly see Terror using Gyo and alter the specifics of the trap. Since he wouldn't be able to see any end aura while using his foresight, Terror wouldn't be able to fully trust it, since he could be walking through a dozen threads or chains without even knowing it. Since escape isn't an option, at worst, Terror would be caught, and at best, it would be a stalemate. Unlike simple transmuted substances or conjured objects which don't use up too much aura by themselves, at some point Terror would most likely run out of aura to fuel Beelzebub with, and I don't think I have to go into what happens then. And that's how you delete 4th Prince Terror-Sandwich from the timeline. Before finishing up though, there is one more general method I forgot to mention. Conditional abilities whose conditions are not visually obvious and which can have a delayed effect would also work great in bypassing Terror's ability. Think abilities like Leol's Rental Pod or Genthru's Countdown, i.e. abilities whose conditions aren't obvious, like needing to punch someone, but that are still combat viable and whose conditions can be secretly fulfilled through cunning or sleight of hand during combat, and then activated at any point, making them uncounterable for Terror since he couldn't go back in time to avoid the conditions being fulfilled in the first place. So, neither of the two abilities I mentioned, and I'm way too tired and pressed for time to come up with one now. So, if you're up for some Hatsu creation, feel free to give it your best go in the comments below. As you could see, some of these methods, such as the spray and pray and blitzing tactic, only really work if Terror is activating his ability at basically the same time as the challenger, and wouldn't work if he has as much as a few seconds of leeway to avoid them. However, since he can't use his ability non-stop, it's not impossible that he'd find himself in just such a situation, even outside this forced hypothetical scenario. Occluding the Nen Beast's vision, keeping track of the real terror, or setting traps within are definitely the more viable options between the 5, of course. Also, the reason I didn't mention Melody's melody is simply because Terror had already experienced it and would almost certainly expect and be prepared for similar abilities that may seek to ruin his focus and make him inadvertently rescind Zetsu. So, do any of you have any particularly effective or fun ideas on how to counter Terror's future sight? If so, I am genuinely interested. Before finishing up, I'd very much like to thank the thinkers and overthinkers for going the extra mile in supporting the channel. As always, thank you very much for watching, your feedback is always appreciated, subscribe if you like more content like this, and I'll see you in the next one.